With that, I would like to introduce our three speakers that we have today. First, you will be hearing, or excuse me, second, you will be hearing from Ted Glenn, who is an author and educator spending his time between Toronto and Grey County, Ontario. By day, he teaches the Canadian government history at Humber College. He writes about the interstices, of Canadian history, including riding into battle, Canadian cyclists in the Great War. He's also written Lawrence of Canada, how the legend of the dashing British First World War hero went through a test run in Toronto, which he will be speaking about today. He's also written Embattled, Two Journalists, a burlesque scar, and the expedition to oust Louis Riel. And Ted is currently working on a book about the life and times of Sir Mackenzie Bowell's Sixth Ministry. Michelle Toussaint, who we'll be hearing from first, is a professor of history at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, where she currently researches World War I in the Middle East and the British Empire. Her books include The British Empire and the Armenian Genocide and Smyrna's Ashes, Humanitarianism, Genocide, and the Birth of the Middle East. She has published articles in the American Historical Review and past and present, and is currently working on a book entitled The Last Treaty, The Middle Eastern Front and the End of the First World War, which rewrites the final years of the war as a story of humanitarian crises and failed diplomacy. And finally, Edward Owens, who is a historian of modern Britain and the Empire. His work on T.E. Lawrence reflects his interest in the way new types of journalism transformed how the media audiences in the 1920s and 30s were encouraged to think and feel about modern British celebrities. His current research focuses on the projection and reception of the British royal family's public image. He is the author of The Family Firm, Monarchy, Mass Media, and the British Public, and is currently working on a new project which explores the role played by royalty in the decolonization of the empire. He is a regular contributor to television series on the royals, including programs aired on CNN and the BBC. With that, we'll be turning over to our first presenter, Dr. Michelle Toussaint.
Thank you, James. I'm going to share my screen. Give me a minute to get myself squared away here. Okay. How did Thomas Edward Lawrence, born in 1888, the bastard son of Thomas Chapman and Sarah Yenner of North Wales, become Lawrence of Arabia? His participation in the Middle East theater of war as a member of the British military intelligence inspired the legend which we are going to talk about today. Lawrence was a spy who believed that he served the interests of his country as well as those of the Arab people. He willingly and wholeheartedly embraced the role of insider-outsider who navigated the space between patriot and power broker. Are we having trouble seeing my presentation?
Yes.
Yes, thank you. Let me share this other one. Thank you for that. Yes, thumbs up. James, can you see it?
We're good now.
Thank you. My apologies for that. It happens, too many screens are open, I guess. All right, thank you. All right, let me go. So my first image was Lawrence and his family. Didn't miss too much. I'm sure for those of you who know the story of Lawrence know this image well. He's the second son here. There's Lawrence in his military uniform. Lawrence was a spy who believed that he served the interests of his country as well as those of the Arab people. He willingly and wholeheartedly embraced the role of insider-outsider who navigated the space between patriot and power broker. His wartime exploits reveal how he straddled this world. Letters I found while researching my new book chart Lawrence's interactions with General Allenby, who commanded the Middle Eastern Front during World War I. From the perspective of Allenby's wartime correspondence, Lawrence looks like a maverick who doesn't always have the full confidence of his superiors. At the same time, he appears as the face of the British-Arab alliance. This image, this next image, of Emir Faisal in front and T.E. Lawrence at the Versailles Peace Conference puts this dual identity on public display. Lawrence advocated for Faisal and appeared with him in public throughout the war, not just at the peace conference. In fall 1918, he appeared before Allenby at the Hotel Victoria to convey Faisal's request to enter Damascus on a donkey in a well-choreographed display intended to represent Faisal as the leader of the Arab people. An officer recalled this meeting between Allenby, Lawrence, and Faisal. When Faisal objected to the news that the French would have the upper hand in Syria, Lawrence was asked by Allenby, but did you not tell Faisal that the French were to have the protectorate over Syria? To which Lawrence answered, no, sir, I knew nothing about it. When pressed further, Allenby admitted that Faisal was to have nothing to do with the Lebanon. Lawrence again refused to acknowledge that he had any prior knowledge of the French control over the region promised to the Arabs. Here's a page from the correspondence, just to look at my, I'm sorry, let's see, back one. Here's a page of this from his correspondence that I just quoted. At the Hotel Victoria, Lawrence openly objected to the British High Command dictates and chafed at the possibility of working with the French regarding Syria. Allenby, in response, quickly scuttled Faisal's plan of a humble yet heroic entry into Damascus that day on the donkey, much to the dismay of both Faisal and Lawrence. General Allenby knew what he was doing. The general had previously cast himself in the role of hero using a similar symbolic kind of entry in Jerusalem after the fall of Jerusalem to the Allies. And here is Allenby in the front, entering humbly through the gates, not on a horse. And so he knew what Faisal was going to do and denied it to Faisal. After Faisal left the meeting to embark on a much more low-key public appearance than originally planned on the streets of Damascus, Lawrence announced that he was going on leave to England. He had made his point. High Command eventually relented and allowed Lawrence, as one observer put it, to, quote, explain the Arab point of view to the king when he returned to England. In the end, Lawrence's wartime intrigues resulted in few dividends for the Arabs whom he claimed to represent, and he himself came to view his advocacy work as a failure. For the Allies, the Arab alliance, brokered in part by Lawrence and built on the lies of the Sykes-Picot Agreement and later the Mandate System, created chaos in the post-Ottoman Middle East. It fueled sectarian violence and instability in the weak nation states carved out of the former Ottoman Empire. This mess pot in Mesopotamia, as the British came to refer to it during this time, had been years in the making. Here is a map, a historic map, of the long, chaotic dismemberment of the Ottoman Empire, which culminated with its destruction in World War I. And here's, of course, the Syria Protectorate that I just referenced in the quoted letter. Despite the failure to honor the Arab alliance, the romantic image of Lawrence, which emerged from his wartime intrigues, proved irresistible. In the hands of journalist and promoter Lowell Thomas, who we'll hear about next, Lawrence emerged as the hero. His exploits offered a war-weary public proof that the battle to control the Middle East had been worth the fight. But another more complicated narrative surrounding the myth of Lawrence of Arabia also took root during this time. According to Stephanie Barchevsky, the hero who failed to achieve his stated objective became a sort of cult figure in Britain during this time. T.E. Lawrence fits this description of what Barchevsky calls, quote, heroic failure. He openly regarded his advocacy efforts as a failure and refused honors and accolades for his war work. His heroic failure, embraced as the quixotic emblem of Englishness, helped build the myth of a man who allowed others to shape his legacy. He himself exposed very little about his own personal and professional life to the public, leaving men like Thomas to do it for him. Importantly, I think, these romantic imaginings, which made T.E. Lawrence into Lawrence of Arabia, also shaped how the West saw the Middle East, and I would argue sees the Middle East today. The Lawrence of Arabia myth provided for many a first glimpse of a place and a people most had only read about in the Bible. Arabs were seen through these eyes. Here is a still from the David Lean film, again, we'll hear about later, two stills, with Lawrence literally portrayed by Peter O'Toole as the knight in white. The image of an enigmatic Lawrence translated into a mixed up interpretation of the Arab as inscrutable, transposing the unknowable Lawrence into the unknowable Arab. Simply put, race matters when we think about Lawrence of Arabia. Representations of him on the battlefront and in popular media and film shaped the West's perception of the Middle East and its people as mysterious and indecipherable. I'd like to turn our attention to the myth of Lawrence of Arabia today, around the world today, actually specifically in the Arab world. Arabs were given limited play over Syria after World War I, as that letter I started my presentation with indicated. And Lawrence was the face of these negotiations. As you might expect, his reputation in the Arab world is very different than it is in the West. Though there isn't a lot of research on how Lawrence is remembered in the Middle East, he seems to represent an ambivalent figure in the Arab world, admired for his work in some quarters with Faisal and disdained in others because he was considered a traitor to the cause of an independent Arab state. This is an important part of the story to remember. It's therefore worth more fully reconstructing Lawrence's memory to better understand how World War I in the Middle East is remembered and understood today in both the West and the East. In 2015, there was an art exhibition launched on this very question from the perspective of the Arab world, and it was held in Amman, Jordan, at the Darat El Fannin Gallery Space. You're looking at the front, the opening, the museum itself, the gallery space. The building itself, interestingly, I think, was the first official residence of the British commander of the Arab Legion until 1938, and Lawrence was said to have stayed here. The image I showed at the beginning of Lawrence in Arab dress may also have been taken here. I'd like to end my presentation. Here's another historic image of the gallery site, where it is now today. I'd like to end my presentation by contrasting the image of Lawrence Arabia from the advertisement for the David Lean film with an image from the exhibition. Here is the familiar image of the popular imagination of Lawrence as hero of his own story. And those of you who've seen the film, thanks to last week, can really see how this poster really is doing a lot of work here to make Lawrence this hero of his own story. But the image of a swashbuckling Peter O'Toole liberating the Arab people from the bondage of the Ottoman Empire is not the only way audiences see World War I in the Middle East, obviously. So I'd like to suggest and explore another way. This image, which I'd like to contrast, is from this 2015 exhibition in Jordan, organized by artist-in-residence Tom Hunter. And it puts not Lawrence, but the Arab soldier here at the center of the story, not swashbuckling Peter O'Toole, but the Arab is highlighted and spotlighted. I think this is an unsettling image, and it unsettles the Lawrence myth specifically by representing a plaintively expressive Arab face spotlighted in red and set against a fiery gold sky that belies the passive sandy tones of the desert in the Lawrence of Arabia film poster I just showed to you. This image, he is next to a British Army officer, which you can see here highlighted in gray, and which bleeds over into the spotlight. I'd like to conclude by suggesting that when we look for the real or mythic Lawrence of Arabia, that it's worth considering the context and also who is doing the remembering. How we see Lawrence of Arabia depends on where and how we focus the center of our attention. Thank you. I'd like to hand the floor over to Ted, who will now talk about Lowell Thomas.
Thank you, Michelle. And now I'm going to take a moment to share my screen. Just got to maximize that. Bear with. And I think here it goes as smoothly as you'd like. So, as Michelle suggested, I want to get to the question of how did Lowell Thomas help construct the legend of Lawrence of Arabia? The United States entered the Great War in April 1917, and soon after, A young and upcoming journalist and a public lecturer named Lowell Thomas convinced US officials to approve, in his words, a trip to Europe to gather material for a series of war travelogues. These were to be illustrated with about 3 reels of colored motion pictures interspersed with 150 color slides each. The officials agreed they could all use the publicity, they could use all the publicity they could get for their participation in an unpopular war. To help fund his trip, Thomas secured credentials as a war correspondent from 26 major newspapers across North America, including the New York Globe, the Ottawa Citizen, and the Toronto Star. Thomas promised to provide weekly war updates in exchange for the newspaper sponsoring his travelogues after the war. Thomas spent 4 months on the Western Front with little action to report on. The belligerents were dug in, literally, with the stalemate extending all the way from the Strait of Dover to Switzerland. And then, in December 1917, Thomas learned that British General Edmund Allenby had captured Jerusalem. It was a much more sensational story, and Thomas sought British and American support to visit the Middle East. As he pitched it to officials, the restoration of Palestine to the Christians after 400 years of Muslim occupation was of the greatest possible importance to his North American readers. Permissions were again secured, and Thomas, with his trusty cameraman Henry Chase, set sail for Palestine in early January 1918. In transit, Thomas said he heard fantastic yarns in hushed tones about a certain young Englishman who was said to be at the head of the wild Bedouin hordes, which were sweeping the Turks out of Mecca, Medina, and all of Holy Arabia. On February 27th, Thomas and Chase met the man behind the rumors, Colonel Thomas Edward Lawrence in Jerusalem. In his diary, Thomas described the 29-year-old as being 5'4" with skin too fair even to bronze after 7 years in the Arabian desert, adding that the very quiet-talking, very modest research man from Magdalen College, Oxford, went about barefoot and in the costume of an Arab warrior. Said Thomas, he is an Emir chieftain of the Hejaz, and the only white man ever made a Sharif, and probably only one who ever will be. Always alone with Arabs. Last year never slept more than 3 nights in one place. He acts for the Sharif, signs his name for him, and has free hand. He really brought Arabs north into Syria. Arabs trust him because he has accomplished results no one else ever did. Price of 5,000 pounds on his head by the Turks. Thomas and Chase spent 5 days with Lawrence, mostly in and around Aqaba, gathering stills and film of the blue-eyed king of the Hejaz in action. They spent another 5 days traveling through the region, gathering material for the travelogues, and then began the long trip home, first through the Mediterranean in the summer, across the Western Front in the fall, and eventually through post-war revolutionary Germany in early winter, gathering material for additional shows. Back in New York, Thomas and Chase spent much of February 1919 putting their miles of film and thousands of stills into travelogue format, which Thomas again described as moving pictures and stills that transport audiences to places they'd only imagined, a wholly new and spectacular form of entertainment, such as no one had ever before attempted in an elaborate way. 6 shows eventually emerged, including Revolution in Germany, with Allenby in Palestine, and Freeing Holy Arabia. Fred Taintor, editor of the New York Globe and Thomas's official sponsor in New York, booked the Midtown 2,300-seat Century Theater for a 2-week engagement beginning March 2nd, 1919. Thomas originally planned to show all 6 travelogues at the Century, but only 2, Revolution and Allenby, actually made it to the stage. Thomas's wife, Frances, said that Tommy had been so swamped with the managing end and the publicity that he had not a moment to prepare speeches or to go through his slides with Mr. Chase. Thomas judged the initial run at the Century a messy experiment, financially a howling failure. The popularity of Allenby, though, was enough for Taintor to book the 1,200-seat Garden Theater, which is next door to the Madison Square Gardens, for a 5-week engagement beginning March 17. Only near the end of that run did Thomas show Freeing Holy Arabia, the amazing story of a mysterious Englishman for the very first time. Legend has it, the British impresario Percy Burton saw Allenby at the Garden Theater and was so impressed that he begged Thomas to bring the travelogue to England, even promising to book the Royal Opera House in Covent Garden for the show and to arrange a personal invitation from King George V. Whatever it took, Thomas opened at the Royal Opera House on August 14th, 1919, with a new show, The Last Crusade with Allenby in Palestine and Lawrence in Arabia. By all accounts, opening night, the 6-month London run overall was spectacular. The 2-hour multimedia extravaganza featured 240 lantern slides, 30 film segments, and live musical accompaniment. The show stood in striking contrast to the amateurishness of the New York shows. So what exactly happened between New York and London? Well, following the garden run in New York, Thomas hired a small team of publicists and admin, including a young Dale Carnegie, to hone his existing scripts into a tighter, more cohesive narrative that could be used to sell the show at home and abroad. Over the course of 6 weeks, they packaged that narrative into a variety of products: new scripts for the shows, newspaper articles that could be used to promote upcoming shows in local newspapers, serialized contributions to magazines like Asia and The Strand to build international attention, and Thomas's best-selling biography with Lawrence in Arabia, eventually published in 1924. In June, Thomas and Chase took the new products on the road to work out the kinks before heading to London. They held a 2-week run in Toronto at the storied Massey Hall, a 1-week engagement in Columbus, Ohio, and then another 2-week run in Orchard Beach, New Jersey. The final touches were completed on the voyage to England at the end of July. According to Thomas, all day and far into the night, Carnegie, Chase, and I huddled over a projector and scripts, working under the pressure of an opening less than 2 weeks on. And by the time we docked at Southampton, we had cut each of the shows by about 45 minutes and then combined the 2 parts into one tight, swiftly moving show, The Last Crusade, with Allenby in Palestine and Lawrence in Arabia. The stories and text-heavy ads published in the Toronto Star between May 26th and June 16, 1919, to promote the run at Massey Hall, give a good sense of Thomas's version of the Lawrence of Arabia legend and how he and his team packaged it. In the Star, Lawrence is described as quiet, rather shy, beardless, with ruddy cheeks. With a more expansive canvas available in Asia and the Strand, Lawrence becomes quiet, rather shy, beardless, with ruddy cheeks, possessing in fact none of the physical attributes which attracted the admiration of the Arabs in general. In the Star, Lawrence's defining contribution to the Arab revolt is resolving the great problem of all ages in that country, namely getting the rival chieftains to unite under one leader. At more length in Asia and the Strand, Lawrence is said to have achieved the impossible. He brought the disunited nomadic tribes of Arabia into a unified campaign against their Turkish oppressors, a difficult and splendid stroke of policy which caliphs, statesmen, and sultans had been unable to accomplish in centuries of effort. Thomas Lawrence placed himself at the head of the Bedouin army of the king of Hijaz, drove the Turks from Arabia, and restored the caliphate to the descendants of the prophets. Allenby liberated Palestine, the holy land of Jews and Christians. Lawrence freed Arabia, the holy land of millions of Mohammedans. The Star said the key to Lawrence's success was his uncanny ability to win the esteem of the Bedouins and to completely captivate every Arab chieftain with whom he came in contact. In this, Lawrence's chief hold upon his men was his personal bravery. He would charge ahead of the wild tribesmen in the thickest fighting, and although many bullets passed through his flowing garments, he was never once injured. Lawrence was esteemed because he could ride harder, shoot straighter, fight with greater daring, and endure the hardships of the desert with less fatigue than any of them. Asia reported similarly. Lawrence won the admiration and undying devotion of the Arabs because of his understanding of them, through his proficiency in their dialect and his rare knowledge of their religion, an inestimable factor in settling disputes between antagonistic factions, and even more perhaps because of his fearlessness and reckless courage, his ability to outdo them in nearly everything in which they themselves excelled. You get the idea. Lowell Thomas created a media juggernaut with his version of the Lawrence of Arabia legend. After a 6-month run in London, Thomas took The Last Crusade on the road to India, Burma, Canada, the United States. By 1928, over 4 million people worldwide had seen The Last Crusade, and millions more had read Thomas's publications. But just how truthful was the legend? Lawrence himself was well aware of the production. He answered questions and posed for photos in London in Arab dress, but had mixed feelings about the result. He once asked a friend, "Have I deserved a Lowell Thomas? His articles and lectures are rank as possible and are making my life very difficult for me, as I have neither the money nor the wish to maintain my constant character as the Montbon he makes me. Lawrence withdrew from public life in 1922 and later wrote his own story in the book, Seven Pillars of Wisdom. Thomas was not oblivious to how Lawrence felt. In one of the articles published in the magazine Asia, he said Lawrence once sent him a note saying, "I saw your show last night and thank God the lights were out." Thomas went on, "Although all London was talking about him, not even his landlady knew who he was. But the uncrowned king of Arabia could not long keep his identity a secret. A host of reporters, photographers, publishers, and feminine admirers were on his trail. After I had been reciting his exploits for 2 months, Lawrence implored me to return to America." But of course he didn't. For Lowell Thomas, The Last Crusade was just the beginning of a storied career in journalism and media production that would span the better part of the 20th century. Ed, I turn it over to you. Once I stop sharing.
Thank you very much, Ted. Hopefully you can all hear me. James, also thank you for your earlier introduction. I'm now going to turn over to my screen. James, if you could just please confirm that you can see my PowerPoint.
We can see your screensaver. Now we can see your PowerPoint. Perfect.
Excellent. Thank you very much, James.
No problem.
And greetings, everybody, from Herefordshire in the United Kingdom. The historian Graham Dawson argued that Lawrence was presented by Lowell Thomas as an imperial soldier hero in the mold of earlier Victorian heroes of empire. The First World War in Europe had raised serious concerns about British masculinity and concepts of manliness. War no longer seemed glorious. Soldiers' bodies had been blown to pieces and fighting men had succumbed to terror when confronted by the new lethal technologies of modern industrial warfare. Thus, the Lawrence myth acted as a redemptive myth, helping to reassure the public that older versions of martial masculinity, brave, courageous, daring, as enacted in the Arabian desert, had survived the wanton death and destruction of the Western Front. The imperial soldier hero, Lawrence of Arabia, was a coherent and largely stable public identity, which, as Ted has shown, carried wide appeal among audiences, not just in Britain, but around the empire. But from the early 1920s onwards, Lawrence's media image would become increasingly mysterious, confused, and characterized by a secrecy and distance that acted as a barrier between media audiences and the man himself. As we've heard, Lawrence came to detest his image as Lawrence of Arabia. He felt that Thomas had exploited his war reputation for commercial gain, creating a false narrative that misrepresented the reality of the conflict in the Middle East. Overwhelmed by publicity and personally burnt out by the diplomatic wrangling involved in the post-war settlement of the Middle East, he secretly enlisted in the Royal Air Force under the assumed name John Hume Ross. The RAF appealed to Lawrence because it was modern. He loved technology and was fascinated by the possibilities opened up by the new Air Force. Crucially, he enlisted as an ordinary private in an attempt to rediscover his anonymity, becoming an aircraftman in the aerial photography section at Farnborough in South England. However, his peace was short-lived. At the end of December 1922, the Daily Express, one of Britain's leading tabloid newspapers, announced in a front-page newspaper story that Lawrence had rejoined the military as an ordinary private. Journalists were bemused as to why the colonel had, and I quote the Daily Sketch newspaper, started again in a much more lowly position than he ever occupied before. Journalists assumed that his re-enlistment must have concealed a secret motive and conjectured that he was a secret agent involved in some greater government plot. This was a period when the press routinely speculated about conspiracy theories involving the British state. Why? Because conspiracy theories sold newspapers. It was also a period marked by a high demand for fictional stories involving spies and confidence tricksters. This was thus the cultural backdrop which helped determine the mutation of Lawrence's public image. The Daily Sketch even managed to capture a candid photograph of Lawrence in his RAF blues, seen here in this slide, which it then juxtaposed with two other older images in order to present him as, and I again quote, a master of disguise. Lawrence was expelled from the RAF after the Ross episode. In 1926, he was permitted to re-enter the force and did so this time under the new alias T.E. Shaw, which he had adopted by default. Again, in search of anonymity and hoping he could avoid further journalistic attention following the publication of the abridged version of his war memoir, Seven Pillars of Wisdom, he chose to be stationed as an air mechanic at an RAF base in India. His peace and tranquility were relatively short-lived. Sections of the British press, ever hungry for a good story, renewed their interest in him in 1928, with reports claiming he was on a secret mission, dressed, and I quote, as a Mohammedan saint, working against the Soviets in Central Asia. These stories were reminiscent of the great game narratives that had pitted British and Russian spies against one another in the 19th century. The reports were, of course, nonsense, but representations of Lawrence as, quote, the arch spy of the world did much to fuel journalistic interest in him. Historian Priya Satia has argued that Lawrence thus became the poster boy for the new types of imperial espionage that were being used by the British state to control its empire. Unfortunately for Lawrence, the rumours led to his recall to Britain. By 1928, the secret agent narrative was in fact in decline because the wild media speculation was exhausting itself. Lawrence's public image had become absurdly distorted beyond any semblance of reality. Indeed, many of Britain's newspapers denied the arch spy stories of 1928 or simply refused to print them. Instead, news editors started to shift their attention to the so-called real man behind the fantastical public image. Who was the real Lawrence and what made him tick? Despite all of the public attention, Lawrence had remained extremely private and had not dispelled the rumors that had swirled around him. Very little was really known about the man behind the image. Historian Charles Ponce de Leon has shown how the late 1920s was a period marked by an intensification of the media's exposure of celebrities' private lives. This mirrored a growing belief that a public image was just that, public and not real. The real person existed only in private. The problem for journalists was that Lawrence was not interested in opening up about his private life. He shunned the advances of the media and was thus cast as a reluctant celebrity, similar to other shy stars like actress Greta Garbo and aviator Charles Lindbergh. More skeptical journalists even posed the question, was Lawrence's reluctance to engage with them all part of a bigger ploy to generate even greater media attention? Here we can see a quote from the Daily Mirror which highlighted this exact point. Evidently, it's taking Lawrence too long, to realize there's no surer way of becoming immensely famous than to keep intensely quiet. Advertising has done that. Almost everybody advertises. Everybody who wants to be celebrated blows his own trumpet. Consequently, the only trumpets that are heard are those that are not sounded. Hence Colonel Lawrence's fame. He must come out dressed as an Arab and sound a fanfare. Nobody will notice. He will at once sink into obscurity. Then, for the first time in 1934, a British newspaper journalist from the News Chronicle published what he claimed was an exclusive interview with Lawrence. He titled the article, "Lawrence of Arabia Talks." Lawrence, by this time an RAF mechanic working on new engines for speedboats at Hythe on the south coast of England, was reported telling the journalist how he detested the Lawrence of Arabia myth and the specious stories that had been presented him, that had presented him as a secret agent. Instead, he emphasized his love of technology and opened up about his reasons for avoiding the limelight. And I quote again, "I like my work on aeroplanes, powerboats, machines. It's an ordinary man's job. It gives me pleasure. There is no mystery about me. I am just an ordinary man trying to earn his living in the way that he likes. The mystery is fictitious. I want to be left alone, not hounded from pillar to post, not forced to leave my lodgings because I am supposed to be a notorious character. I want to be left alone." The 1934 News Chronicle interview was the closest a journalist ever got to exposing the real Lawrence to British readers. 1 year later, Lawrence was killed when he was thrown from one of his beloved motorcycles when he collided with a cyclist close to his home in Dorset. Some of Britain's newspapers, having never really understood Lawrence's impulse towards obscurity, immediately recast him in the older role of secret agent and fueled a conspiracy theory that the British state had covered up the real cause of his death. The Daily Mail even went so far as to claim that Lawrence had taken with him to his grave the plans for the next great war that would see Britain fighting against Germany once again. After his death, close-up images of Lawrence were released, like this one, for the first time, giving viewers a much clearer impression of what the man actually looked like. For the first time, cinema goers also got to see Lawrence up close and personal as new newsreel films were released of him picnicking with friends. This was the real Lawrence that had eluded them for so long. Lawrence's writings, most notably Seven Pillars of Wisdom, ensured that he became the key influence in shaping his own image after his death. It was only after he died that a version of Seven Pillars was published for public consumption that contained description of the homosexuality of young Arab men. This, along with the subsequent publication of the full, unexpurgated version of Seven Pillars, which included a description of Lawrence's rape at the hands of a Turkish soldier at Deira, would fuel questions over his sexuality. Lawrence's sexuality was one of the key themes explored by David Lean in his epic 1962 reimagining of the hero story in the film Lawrence of Arabia, with Peter O'Toole in the lead role. Lean relied heavily on Seven Pillars as the source material for his analysis of Lawrence as a psychologically damaged figure. Again, the image of Lawrence thus took on new meanings as wider society became more attuned to ideas of war-induced trauma and psychological suffering. And yet, the Lean film was also a response to the anxieties and concerns of the period in the way it addressed Britain's imperial legacy. By 1962, the empire was in rapid retreat, with decolonization sweeping through Africa and Asia. In many ways, and here I rely on historian Graham Dawson's analysis again, Lean breathed new life into a Lawrence myth not so dissimilar to that created by Lowell Thomas in 1919. Lean's film glorified the romance of empire and the excitement of war, while also highlighting the more problematic elements of both. Thus, in just over 4 decades, Lawrence's public image went through a dramatic series of transformations, with each new version of Lawrence emerging from a wider political, social, and cultural context. It just remains to be seen how that image will continue to evolve over time.
Well, thank you very much to Ed, to Ted, and to Michelle as well. What we are going to say right now is we've already got some amazing questions that have come in, and we'd be happy to answer any of those. So I will invite all of our presenters, including one of our sponsors, Mr. George Thompson, to turn their cameras and microphones back on. And I will also take down this slide so you can see all of our bright and shining faces. We have some great questions that came in. Some are very much directed at a particular presenter, but others I will open up to everybody. So one of the first, this one is directed at you, Ted, and I find this one to be really interesting because it gets into memory and how we perceive a person as a society versus individuals. And this question is, how would T.E. Lawrence's contribution to the Arab Revolt have been assessed without Lowell Thomas?
It's an interesting question. I mean, the first newspaper article of Lawrence's, and I might get the date wrong, so excuse me, September 18, 1918, first reference to him. And very, very quickly, though, by the summer of 1919, the topic of Lawrence of Arabia is actually quite popular on the Chautauqua circuit, which is an older form of public lectures that typically were held outdoors near state fairs and stuff, both in Canada and the United States. They tended to rely somewhat on all of the stuff that Thomas was publicizing, but a bunch of other material as well. So that legend was much broader than Thomas. He just happened to be the media juggernaut or turning it into a juggernaut that he did. But I think if Thomas hadn't done it, I think somebody else might very well have. There were a lot of contenders out there for that crown.
Well, and that is a great answer to that. And this one, it's directed, I think everybody should be able to have their say on this one, which comes to us from Jason Burgess. How would you assess the representation of T.E. Lawrence? Who he was and what actually occurred? In the David Lean film, is there a better movie to watch than the famous Lawrence of Arabia? And I will let everybody take their turn answering that. And I see
May I start, Jay?
Let him go first. Yes.
Thank you very much. I think the Lean film, and I saw it in because there's a shortened Lean film and a full version of the Lean film, and I saw it in its full version about 10 years ago. It's one of the most beautiful films ever made, and I think it really did glorify this image of Lawrence as I think I hope to say. A difficult person who found himself in extraordinary circumstances within this magnificent setting. It was at the same time a hugely romanticized version of that Middle Eastern campaign. So it's really complicated. I think the true Lawrence we're never going to get to know. And the great thing about Lawrence is that even his biographers have never really been able to really get to grips with the inner man in terms of his motivations. They've speculated, sure, but there's so much conjecture around Lawrence as to who he really was, how the Middle Eastern campaign left him after the war, what his motivations were when it came to the Paris peace treaties, and that afterlife as well in the 20s and 30s, as I try to highlight. It's really complicated. And the fact that he never gave us, I think, Seven Pillars was written and originally with if you like, an audience in mind of an elite literary audience. But he knew that this thing was going to get a wider publication after his death. So I think it was always written with a wider audience in mind. And in that respect, he was carefully constructing a public image, even through that text, in terms of how he wanted people to think of him, and how he wanted to be remembered.
That's an excellent answer. And I see George raising his hand as well. So George, it might
Yeah,
want.
I just want to build off of what Ed is saying in that there really are only that I know of 2 full-length features that deals with Lawrence's story. And of course, The Lean is the main one because it's so epic. The other is the film with Ralph Fiennes that deals with Lawrence at the Paris Peace Conference. And it's a very boutique type film and quite interesting, but it takes a different phase of his experience and explores the inner personality and the psychology of the mind. And I would close with adding that Lawrence was aware that there was a desire to make a film about him. It traces back to Michael Korda's father, Alex Korda, who is a famous filmmaker and producer in Britain. And so Korda had the rights to the story of some sort to do a film in the 30s. And Lawrence actually visited with him to persuade him not to do it. Again, following Ed's notion of the obscurity that he wished to have and maintained. And of course, the Second War actually eclipsed that. And I might even add, it was interesting that the character to play Lawrence in the Korda film was to be Leslie Howard, who you may remember from Gone with the Wind. They're very different contrasts and perhaps a little more intriguing than Peter O'Toole.
Excellent answer. And I think that there's so many different, as we've seen from all of your presentations today, and George, from your answer, there's so many different aspects. And it would be really digging into the memory and how that's evolved on this central figure.
Mm-hmm.
Question comes to us from Rebecca McKibben. And this one I think should be directed towards you, Michelle. And that is, what is the current view of the Arab world towards Lawrence? Had it had similar pendulum swings, a traitor or a spy, etc.? I believe that she's saying that we've seen in the West. So how would you answer that?
Well, it's a great question. And I think it's one that needs more research. I mean, the image I showed from that exhibition was from 2015. And when you think about how the image of Lawrence is projected around the world, it is not a romantic image of Lawrence of Arabia that we get when you look at Arab representations. It's much more on the ground. What did it mean? What did it do? And I do think in some ways, when we talk about a legacy of Lawrence of Arabia, we really do have to ask that question, because we can see him as swashbuckling hero. We can talk about how the representation has changed over time, but the stakes are pretty high. And one of my frustrations about a figure like Lawrence casting such a large shadow over this period is it gets in the way in some ways of understanding what the war in the Middle East actually meant, because we are obsessed with the man and the tragic hero. But remember, when, between 1918 and 1923, the war is still going on in the Middle East. It is not finalized until the Treaty of Lausanne is signed in 1923. And so I think that when we talk about Arab perceptions, in many ways, we do have to talk about the war itself. And rather than saying, was he our hero? Was he our villain? So what did he do? Well, in that letter I showed you, he was seen as someone who betrayed the Arab cause, but at the same time was someone himself who felt very much like this hadn't gone the way. He wasn't ready for the Middle East to be divided in this way in some ways, right? So I think it's a really good question, and it needs a lot more research. And I hope people will be curious and see more than films and read Priya Satya's book on spies in Arabia. I think that's really going to open it up, and really I think we can get a more multi-dimensional view of what Lawrence actually represents in terms of that war.
And I can very highly recommend Priya Satya's book as well. And just in her title, you brought up something of a contentious issue that I would love everybody's opinion on here. And this word has popped up both before, during, and I'm sure it will be continuing to use after. And that word is spy. Is it right to call Lawrence of Arabia a spy? I know that various sources after the war have, but thinking about this as a term, do you think Lawrence of Arabia truly was a spy, or how would each of you define his role during the war? And I see George raising his hand, so I'll start with you, George.
Well, I think Michelle used that word, and that's a hot button that gets kicked around a lot, and it certainly seems to be something that ignites the public's imagination. I kind of see him as a very complex figure. I like Hannah Arendt's identification of Bell and Lawrence as being part of what's called the imperial agent. And in his actual roles, he's really a strong political operative and liaison with the Arab Bureau. Even though he's an officer in the British Army, he's on the special list. He really is a political operative in many respects, and that's his skill as a communicator with the Sheriftons, who he is an advocate for them. And so his actions, I think, when I think of a spy, I think it more of a concealed, secretive, cloak and dagger kind of activity. He does do some things that would make you wonder about that, because when he goes to his famous ride from Wedge to Aqaba, he actually describes that he took a secret tour into the north to meet with people. Certainly the famous Dara episode is where he's sneaking in to spy out the location and so forth. So, it's kind of it's a complicated word, because on one hand, those two illustrations suggest, yes, that label is correct. On the other hand, his larger picture is more as a political operative. That's my view. But again, the controversy, Michelle and Ed and Ted may have different views.
Yeah, would anybody else like to express theirs? Ed, I see you unmuted.
If I might just come in there, I think the definition of spy. I think it was one of those words that was still going through definition in this period. John Buchan's romances gave meaning to that word. And Lawrence, in his own way, gave meaning to that word. But he was an intelligence officer, but he was also a political operative in the Middle East. He was receiving intelligence, he was making sense of that intelligence and acting politically. So, in terms of this idea of a spy, when we think of a spy nowadays, it's fairly well determined. We're thinking of James Bond and the various other sort of, people representing MI5, MI6, or for that matter, the CIA. But it wasn't like that back then. There wasn't a language of, if you like, the spy. There wasn't a definition for it that's so clear cut. But if you like, the 1920s does see this idea of Lawrence being defined as I refer back to my paper, as the arch spy of the world. And I think that gave a lot of meaning to this idea of the spy, someone that was acting secretly, that was doing things that were sort of underhanded, possibly acting on behalf of the British government, but who knows, maybe he's acting on behalf of some other government. That's the kind of thing that we got from these newspaper reports of the 1920s. They were infatuated with this idea that Lawrence was something else, that it wasn't quite, so he didn't quite add up. And in many respects, I think this, if you like, your question is a great one, because it points to the 1920s as this moment where, if you like, the idea of the spy wasn't really defined. I think that idea of the spy becomes better defined probably later on.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think that we also have to talk about surveillance culture, which emerges for the first time in the war. So airplanes, I mean, he's in the RAF, I mean, right? And surveillance culture, strategic bombing, the idea that you can watch and survey, we think we can, I mean, our world is saturated in it. But in that world, the idea you could fly overhead and see what was happening and do reconnaissance, Lawrence is at the center of that. And I think that when we talk about a transformation, we don't just talk about the word spy developing, but we actually have to talk about the technologies that World War I brings and allows this notion of surveillance, foreign surveillance to happen. And Lawrence is at the nexus of that. And so whether you want to argue he's a spy or he's not a spy, he is certainly someone who is part of this new surveillance culture and embracing the technology and really, really sees himself as a central player in that.
Yeah, I want to agree with Michelle on that. That's a very important insight she offers, because, you know, his relationship with Air Marshal Trenchard is established in probably about 1921 at the Cairo conference. He meets with Trenchard and Solomon, and they're really struggling as to how they can contain the rebellions that are going on in Egypt as well as in Iraq. And so Lawrence spins out. He's not the sole agent. He's just able to help articulate what Churchill wanted to hear, which is that we could police these areas, as Michelle has talked about, with air power and control those villages and those areas and so forth in a way that we don't have to send battalions of infantry in as we used to. So he is really a very subtle figure in that regard.
Well, we're coming towards the end of our time. However, there are a lot of other questions. So on behalf of the National World War I Museum and Memorial, I want to thank all of you for joining us, but would you be willing to stay just for a few minutes more to answer some of these questions that are coming in from across Facebook as well as Zoom? Well, sounds good. For those of you who joined us, thank you very much. For our diehards, feel free to stick around because we've got some other questions that are coming up here, and I can't wait to hear the answers to them. So with that, this one comes from Laura Pritchard, who is commenting from Facebook Live. Can anyone speak of T.E. Lawrence's friendship with George Bernard Shaw and how it affected him?
Okay, I'll take that one. Lawrence met Charlotte and George Bernard Shaw by chance through Sidney Cockerell. I think it was probably in March of 1922, and they were just going by. Cockerell is a curator at, I believe, at one of the museums at Cambridge. I could have that wrong. And Lawrence was introduced to Shaw, and when he decided that he would do a third version of his manuscript, Seven Pillars of Wisdom, he printed it out and sent it for circulation. And the first two people that he asked to read his new draft, which he had great aspirations for, was Edward Garnett and George Bernard Shaw. And that was the beginning of the relationship. And they sustained that relationship right up to Lawrence's death. I find it's interesting what Shaw's personality was. Many folks just can't I don't think Shaw quite knew what to make of Lawrence. When you read, if you want to really drill down on this, you need to read the letters that Shaw and Lawrence wrote to each other. That will give you something, because when I've looked at those, what's striking is that Lawrence will raise a series of mea culpas on his writing. I'm not confident about it. I'm not sure about it, etc. And Shaw just says, man up and do it and solve it and so on and so forth. And he never quite figured out what he was doing in the Air Force or the Army. He called it tank foolery and so forth. Now, on the other hand, the real connecting link, the one that you really want to look at, whoever asked the question, is the relationship of Lawrence with Charlotte Shaw. That is the one that is far more emotive and emotionally satisfying. She becomes kind of a confidant and someone looking out for him in many ways. So I could go on this, but I think I'm going to stop at that point.
And if I may, George, just to intervene, the reason why he takes the name T.E. Shaw is in sort of homage to that couple who he'd become so enamored with. Right. He had a great affection for them, right?
Right. Well, and the Shaws were interesting in that they had no children, and Granville Baker was a British playwright that Shaw, they like to mentor people. And Granville Baker's wife didn't like the Shaws. And so that friendship came to an end, knocking on the door. There's T.E. Lawrence. He's the new son. So.
Well, great. And this one actually we've used both T.E. Lawrence and famously the nickname Lawrence of Arabia. This question comes to us from Ann Meyer. And she asks, when did the term Lawrence of Arabia come to be? Or can we even pinpoint the first instance of that? I think that's a question probably for Ed or Ted.
Ted, can you do that one?
I can try. I couldn't pinpoint it. My guess, it's probably spins out of Thomas's work. I mean, you got a lot of with Lawrence in Arabia, with Lawrence of Arabia. I don't know when the with actually is removed from that reference, but my guess is probably in the early 20s somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
I see shaking heads. I think everybody kind of agrees on that one, but that's also an excellent question. This one comes to us from Graham Miller, And I'm going to direct this one particularly at Michelle, but everybody can have an answer towards this one. How aware was Lawrence of the Zionist movement and its relationship with the British government?
I don't know. And I don't know that I don't really I haven't seen much written about that. You know who might help you there? There's a new book called Partitioning Palestine. That might be a good place to look for that. Some of the correspondence I've been looking at the Allenby as I dig into that, I would not be surprised if that existed there, but I'm sorry, I don't have knowledge of that.
Well, an excellent question, Graham, that as you could tell, maybe that be your new book. We'll look for Graham's new book on T.E. Lawrence and his impact on Zionism. So I think we have time for just one more. This comes to us from Marjorie Asturias. And she asks, Lawrence started out the war as an archaeologist and has often been described, among other roles, as a scholar. Why did he choose to retreat to military life rather than return to an academic life, which presumably might have given him a little bit more isolation?
If I may, I think that, and this is where we can possibly re-enter the world of Lawrence's sexuality, and maybe someone would like to beg to differ, but I think he liked the homosocial atmosphere of the barracks. I think he liked spending time among men. I think he liked the atmosphere of ordinary, of trying to sort of ground himself amongst ordinary people as well. He liked the sort of sense of humor, and at the same time, as we've heard, he also sort of liked to reach high in terms of his literary ambitions. So there's this, and you know, here we're getting to the heart of the Lawrence enigma, in that he combines this sort of this obsession with the proletariat, as we hear him sort of narrate it, the everyday life of the barracks boy, of the private soldier, with the sort of the ambitions of the sort of the literary elite and the George Bernard Shaws of this world. And I think it's this tension within Lawrence in terms of what he wants and what he desires that, you know, has so fascinated scholars and historians for so long. He is genuinely one of the most interesting people who is, if you like, on record at least, of the last 100 years.
Can I build off of that? You know, when Lawrence leaves the war in October of 1918, and his prestige is really remarkable, because when he returns to London in the fall of 1918, and remember, the war in October is not over with yet, he's invited to offer his views on the Middle East to the Eastern Committee, which is the subgroup of the British cabinet. So he's, for some reason, he has just catapulted from a nobody to somebody quite quickly. In that phase from 1918 through 1921 with the Cairo Conference, Lawrence really has two roles. He's really an advocate and he's a diplomat. And his advocacy takes the form of just meetings and goes to the Paris Peace Conference, and he writes articles and so forth. Along the way, the editor of the Times, Geoffrey Dawson, persuades, should you think about taking a fellowship at All Souls College? That's the linkage to returning possibly back to an academic career. And Hogarth, his mentor and the warden at All Souls, arranges, and that's quite a prestigious arrangement. Lawrence really doesn't have the interest at that point. In fact, in one letter to a friend, he says, I tried Oxford again and I didn't like it. He had been transformed, as I would say, as a man of action and searching for other issues. And there are psychological issues as well. And of course, as Ted has showed, this is the period of time when he becomes a public celebrity. So it's very curious. I mean, he was offered, interestingly enough, his tutor suggested that he might want to take a position as the warden at McGill in Canada, and he turned that down. So he, by that time, had actually eschewed an interest in academia, that's what's wonderful about that question, is that it suggests that most men and women, after they've done this service, they return to their previous career. Not this man, not this man.
Well, excellent question. There actually is one more comment that I think would be great to point out, it comes from Steven Schweitzer. I hope I'm pronouncing your name right, sir. He wanted to bring Harvey Granville Barker to the attention of the panelists and audience. Did anyone want to expand on that?
Well, that is the playwright that the Shaws were enamored with and supported. And I don't know a lot about what this gentleman is thinking about, other than that Lawrence did correspond with him and confided with him in terms of his aspirations in terms of writing. And so he figures in the pantheon of individuals, which Lawrence had as quite a robust range of individuals and so forth. That's all I can add.
Well, I want to thank all of you, Ted Glenn, Michelle Toussaint, Ed Owen, and George Thompson for joining us tonight. Make sure to stay tuned to the National World War I Museum and Memorial social media, as well as our calendar of events to hear about our upcoming lectures, as well as our upcoming events. I'm James Taub, the Public Program Specialist here at the National World War I Museum and Memorial. Thank you all very much for joining us, and we'll see you next time.